Hey guys, so I just wanted to give you a quick run through of the interface in Rosewood Grand. So right here on the main interface, in the very center, there's a blend pad here that lets you blend between the different available mic signals. So at the top, there's the harp position, which sounds like this. It's a very warm, dark sound. And then at the bottom, there's the hammers position. Which comparatively is, pretty bright. And then all the way on the left is the room. And then on the left side of the interface, you have additional settings related to each of those signals. So you can turn the signal on and off, you can mute and solo, or invert the polarity. And then there's also a width slider here, which lets you reduce the signal all the way to mono, and then below that, it'll actually invert the left and right channels. And then that way, that natural panning that you get, just due to how the mics are set up, where with the lowest notes kind of sounding on the left side of the stereo field and the high notes sounding on the right, that will get flipped, so then your low notes, sound more on the right side and your high notes on the left. And then you've got a slider to adjust the panning of the signal. And lastly, there's a drop-down menu here where you can send the mic signal out an alternate audio output. And then that way in your DAW, you can have access to those mic signals as separate tracks and mix them however you want, with any number of plugins you want to use. But speaking of effects, moving on to the effects section here, we have a couple useful built-in effects. So there's a compressor, there's an equalizer, and then a convolution reverb. And that has a bunch of different options for various hardware reverb units that we sampled. And within each of those, you have all of the different presets to select between. So that can really give you some cool sounds. And then you have some settings where you can kind of adjust that impulse response. So you can adjust the pre-delay and the mix, of course, as well as the length or size of the impulse response. So if you want it to sound longer, you can do that, or shorter, right? And then lastly, there's a filter as well. So if the reverb sounds too bassy, you can always move this left handle upward and high pass the signal. Or inversely, if it sounds too bright and there's too much high end, you can always, add a low pass filter. So, and you can set both of those handles independently, right? Okay, so that's the convolution reverb. And then moving on to the settings section, right here, we actually sampled the piano several times. And so this is the tuned sample set. And there's also a bloom sample set wherein we just slightly detuned the unisons in the piano. And that way you get more motion in the sustains of the notes. So it's not enough to sound really out of tune or anything, it just adds a really cool character to the sound of the piano. And then moving on, we've got a felted version, and that has two different variations to choose between. There's one that has the room signal like the other pianos do, and then the other option has a signal underneath the piano instead of the room. So if I move the blend all the way to the underneath signal, it sounds really deep and warm. Okay, and then so that's the felt version, and then finally we've got the original samples from the very first release of what was called Evolution Rosewood Grand back then, and then that way you still have access to those original samples. So it's pretty close to the tuned sample set, but you don't have that room signal. We just left the original samples in, so that way if you've got any songs that used the original version, you can get that same sound using the original sample set. Okay, and then down here we've got some controls to adjust the velocity response of the piano. And one notable setting here is the dynamic range. What that does is it lets you bring up the volume of the very softest velocity layers and make them more along the same loudness as the very loudest velocity layers. So if I exaggerate this by turning it way down, if I play softly, you can hear that it's almost just as loud as the very loudest notes. So it's almost acting like a natural compressor, but unlike a compressor, you're not risking squashing the attacks of the notes or anything like that. Okay, and then moving on, we've got a whole section dedicated to the levels of different layers that get added in. So you have the pedal noise sounds, the hammer release sounds, the release samples, and then the damper ambience. And so what that is when you hold down the sustain pedal, the dampers get lifted off of all the strings, and it almost creates this natural reverb inside the piano where all the strings are open to sympathetically resonate with your playing. So if I turn that up just to exaggerate the effect, and then if I turn it off, it's just missing that extra depth of the tone that the damper ambience adds. Okay, and then moving on, we've got sympathetic resonance. So when you turn that on, a good way to test it is just to hold down some keys very quietly and then tap the keys like an octave or two below. And you can hear the notes that I have held here sympathetically resonating with those. Okay, and then we have a noise floor layer here that you can add in. So all the samples have been very meticulously denoised. But if you want to add back in the noise in a static way, meaning that there's just one noise sample and it's not going to add up, the more notes that you play at once, you can add the noise back into the equation using this noise floor option right here. Now, it is very quiet, so you'll probably only notice it if you're using a lot of compression or boosting the EQ in certain frequency ranges. Okay, and then moving on, we've got some miscellaneous settings here. So the timbre control setting, all that's really doing is shifting the samples, borrowing samples from other notes, and that really drastically changes the tone of the piano. So you can get a lot brighter sound. It's almost like a spin-it piano sound to a very dark, warm sound. Okay, and then moving on, there's pre-roll. And so what that is the pre-roll is the audio that happens before the main transient. And so you can add back in a static amount of that pre-roll. And with the piano, that's really just the sound of the hammer moving through the air, before it hits the strings, or the key noises. So it's very subtle, and it will add delay to the sound of the piano. But if you've got compression, that might be bringing that up. It'll really just kind of add more realism to the sound of the piano. But if you're playing it live, you probably want to leave that, pretty low, if not at 0, so that you get a very instantaneous sound. Okay, and then we've got stretch tuning, and what that does is it makes the lowest notes tuned flat and the highest notes tuned sharp. And so the idea is that it adds this kind of sweetness to the tone of the piano. So that's something that you might want to dial in just, based on your own personal preference. Okay, so lastly, if you have a sustain pedal that outputs a continuous value from 0 to 127, these controls here in the sustain pedal section let you really fine-tune the way that your sustain pedal behaves. And so with this first slider right here, you can adjust the center point at which the sustain pedal activates and deactivates. So with a low value, that means that you just have to barely press the sustain pedal and it's already activated. Whereas if you give it a very high value, you have to push the sustain pedal like pretty much all the way down before it actually starts taking effect. So this ties into the next slider, which is the tightness curve. So at 100%, basically your sustain pedal will just operate like a switch, like an on and off switch. And there's no values in between that you would get like half pedaling or slow pedal release. It's just on or off. Now, as you reduce this, you get a smoother and smoother range of values between the sustain pedal being on and off, all the way to where, at 0%, you have a wide range of values, to slowly lift the sustain pedal, and you can hear the strings slowly, fading out as they get muted. And you also get a wide range of values where you can, play half pedaling. Hopefully this video was helpful, and thank you for watching.